In an interview, Korean-American director Lee Isaac Chung said that in writing the screenplay for Minari, he was inspired by a quote from Willa Cather, the Pulitzer Prize-winning American author of My Antonia, who said that her life really began when she stopped admiring and started remembering. The first shots of Minari spell out Chung's personal and intimate orientation towards filmmaking. We start with a close-up of David Yi, the son, who is looking forward. From his perspective, we see his mother Monica driving and his sister Anne reading. Notably, the father character Jacob is not with them. Rather, he is driving ahead of them in the moving truck, which coincidentally bears Willa Cather's name. We see Monica looking at her daughter, who is looking down, and David turn his head sideways to watch the countryside and the title screen. The scene is nice, with hay bales and cows and green forest, and for a certain kind of audience, the environment is even nostalgic. When the family drives up to the house, David gets up and looks puzzled. Monica looks pissed. The first thing the children do when they leave the car is to look at the foundation of the house, which support it in the air. Jacob stands above his wife, trying to convince her to step up and to enter his dream. She struggles, refusing his help. The Garden of Eden upon which Jacob will start his farm is large and full of flowers. In comparison, there is something off about the family that owns it. They are Asian, for one thing. We don't get a lot of their history, where in Korea the parents are from, why they immigrated to California, and how they ended up in rural Arkansas. The parents are Korean immigrants, yet the father Jacob, played by Steven Yeun, has an obvious American accent when speaking Korean, and a terrible Korean accent when speaking English.
David! 아빠는 빅 가든 하나 만들 거야.
Garden is small.
No. Garden of Eden is big.
His wife Monica is clearly a native Korean speaker, but she is much more reticent about her feelings and desires. Both kids suffer from that classic child of immigrants dilemma of speaking both English and their native language at home. Neither have real friends until much later in the film when they meet painfully racist kids at the church. Anne tries to be a good older sister, but gets so little screen time that she can't become her own person. David is much more expressive, often bored and frustrated. Notably, much of the film revolves around his heart murmur, which, if I may interject my medical student side, is likely a ventricular septal defect, a literal hole between the right and left sides of his heart. And the flow between the two halves of the Asian American heart is what Minari is all about. The first 30 minutes of the film are uneventful, as Chung slowly plants the foundations of the myriad relationships that are forced to evolve when the grandmother Sunja arrives. For some of us, Sunja is a breath of fresh air, of familiarity in Isaac Chung's strange and jarring exposition. First of all, because she's played by Yoon Yo-jong, an extremely famous South Korean actress. Secondly, because we instantly recognize her archetype, the boisterous and laid-back Ajumma from Korean dramas or variety shows. She brings with her gochugaru and anchovies, allowing the family to finally enjoy Korean-style home cooking. Unlike either David or Monica, Sunja is not focused on the future. She likes to watch TV. She develops a taste for Mountain Dew. She treats speaking English like a fun joke rather than a burden.
피니스예요.
페니스?
And more importantly, she tries to see the son David as an individual. The transformation in the film is immediate. Monica starts smiling and becomes more loving. Jacob finally starts his farm. The family begins to go to church, and although David is resistant, unable to connect Sunja with his Americanized ideal of what a grandmother should be, to the point that he even tries to poison her, both he and his sister develop a close bond with her.
아이고 지랄. 자 가만있어. 보자. 아이고. 엄마.
For David, his grandmother represents the Korean half of his heart. His parents are of course very Korean too, but they struggle with straddling that identity with a desire to become Americans. Jacob fully buys into the American dream, but he also slips into the classic image of the tiger parent, regularly threatening his son with corporal punishment. The grandmother, in contrast, is much more clear about her own identity, and therefore is in a better position to help David with his. She knows exactly what he needs to hear, that David is stronger than he thinks, and that he should run and push his limits. And indeed, it is this focus on self-realization that allows David's septal defect to resolve on its own, creating harmony between the two sides of his heart.
이런 소리 처음 들어봤어? 데이비사, 너는 스트롱 보이야. 할머니가 본 사람 중에서 제일 스트롱 보이야.
This makes Sunja's stroke all the more tragic and heartbreaking. The night prior, Sunja comforts David, who's worried about dying, in a scene that mirrors an earlier scene with Monica. Through her humming, she transfers her self-confidence to David, ridding him of his incontinence and taking his burdens onto herself. When I worked in my hospital's stroke service, I noticed that many family members struggled with the fact that their loved ones still preserved their memories and personalities, but that their new disabilities now prevented them from expressing themselves and living the way they always did. With Sunja's stroke, the Korean half of the family's identity falls, and soon afterwards, the American half falls too. But it's only in this situation, when the guises of national identity and financial success burn to the ground, that the importance of family becomes key. David, and surprisingly Jacob too, understand this immediately during the film's climactic scene. They realize that a genuine source of happiness is keeping the family together. The importance of Minari as a symbol is not that it's Korean, but that it's a Korean vegetable that can grow anywhere that there is water. Unlike fragile farm crops, the Minari they plant together is resilient, growing not in uniform lines, but in an uncontrolled explosion of green. The last line of the film is of Jacob remarking on Sunja's work, not because he wants to sell them, but because he wants to eat them.